Hi, everyone. This is Lori Barnes, and I'm here with you to talk about Mars retrograde. I am an astrologer and a psychotherapist and a coach. So I work with the retrograde cycles often in my coaching, and I think that they are wonderful cycles to use intentionally and purposefully to help us in life. I know retrogrades tend to get somewhat of a negative reputation. There are definitely annoyances that come with retrogrades and delays and all those typical things that you hear about. What I wanted to do was find a way to work with the retrogrades that's actually helpful. It's good to know all those things about retrogrades, that there's can be delays and setbacks and all those annoying things that we hear about regularly with Mercury retrograde. But there's also really positive things that we can do under a retrograde if we focus on going with the flow of the energy. If we work with the type of energy that's being presented to us, then we can use that energy to do something that actually helps us move forward. Today, we're going to talk about the Mars retrograde, which has already started. It's going to have, some similarities, like, all retrogrades have something in common. And then it's going to have its own flavor because Mars is a different planet and it has different meaning and different qualities for what that planet represents in the sky. So let's just start by talking about the dates, and I will share with you some information about Mars, and then we'll get into the retrograde. And then we'll talk specifically about this retrograde because it is in the sign of Gemini, but all retrogrades, they move through the zodiac, so they're not always in the same sign. So it's important to talk about the difference between this particular Mars retrograde and a different one that would be in a different sign. The Mars retrograde happening right now has already started as I'm recording this video. And there is the pre-retrograde period and post-retrograde period, which I consider as part of the entire cycle. So the entire Mars retrograde cycle is around 6 months, but the actual retrograde part where it starts to go retrograde and ends is not the whole 6 months. So we have this time period before where Mars crosses over the degree that it's going to end up retrograding back to. And that's what marks the beginning of the shadow, the pre-shadow period. And that will go until Mars actually goes retrograde. In this case, the pre-shadow started on September 4th. Quite a ways back, you may remember that you started feeling more tired around that time, or things just started to move more slowly for you. Then on October 30th, Mars went retrograde. So we are right now in the retrograde. I'm recording this for you very early in November. Mars will stay retrograde until January 12th. And then it starts that post-retrograde period or post-shadow. Oftentimes you hear the pre and post time before and after retrogrades as the pre-shadow and the post-shadow. So between January 12th and March 16th is that post-shadow. And what that means is that's the time period where Mars is moving forward again, but it's covering that old ground and it's going back over those degrees where it had gone retrograde. And when it gets to March 16th is when it gets back to that degree, that point in the zodiac where it went retrograde. So those are your dates. The entire cycle is September 4th through March 16th of next year, 2023. And the actual retrograde started on October 30th and it ends on January 12th. With all retrogrades, it is most sensitive on the days it go, well, the day it goes retrograde and the day it goes direct. You feel it though around, the days before and the days after. And if you think about it, it's like if you are walking on soft ground or even mud, and if you stop and you stand still, you kind of sink down into the ground. So it's that concept that when Mars is changing directions, it stops, it slows down, it stops, and it kind of sinks into that particular degree. And that makes it even more sensitive. The quality is just more sensitive around those dates. So just keeping that in mind. Let's talk about Mars in the chart. So Mars in your chart is about how we take action, how we take physical action. It's about our motivation, our drive. It's how we get things done. You could say it's kind of like one of the underlying things behind our motivation and determination. It works in conjunction with other things. No planet in our chart, including the sun and the moon, operate by themselves. And they each have their energetic vibe of what it is that they're doing in the chart. Mars is carrying out kind of the action, taking what we want to do and going and doing it out in the world. But it's also inside of us. It's like our motivation and our drive to get something done. It's representing, though, also the sun and the moon and our ascendant, as in those are our character. And I'm not going to talk deep into those things because the focus is on Mars retrograde. I just want to touch on that because Mars is out carrying out the orders, the desires, and we can't talk about that without understanding that that's coming from our moon, how we get our needs met, our security, our emotions, and our sun, who we are, and what we're destined to develop in our lifetime. And our ascendant is like our personality. It's the filter that everything goes out and comes in to. And of course, there's Mercury, which is our communication style, and Venus, which is our relating style. So Mars doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates in synthesis with all of those things in our chart. So we're going to talk about Mars retrograde today, and just keep in mind that it's not operating all by itself. And though today we're only going to talk about Mars retrograde and what it's doing, that it's important that you remember that that's in the context of there's other things going on in the chart. So retrogrades in general are a time of slowing down, reflecting, and realigning. It's a general concept of a retrograde. When we're talking about Mars, we're talking about how Mars things slow down, realign, where there can be some review, and how that pertains to what Mars does, which is our drive, our action, and how we get things done. And that's why or you probably have heard, or I say that physically you may feel more tired and fatigued under the Mars retrograde. You are probably more familiar with Mercury retrograde. If you want to just kind of understand the difference in timing, the Mars retrograde is the second rarest, you could say. The only planet that goes retrograde less often than Mars is Venus. Then there's Mercury, which is pretty commonly known. It's talked about out in the world beyond astrologers, and that happens about 3 times a year. So Mars is every 2 years. And then there's, Jupiter and Saturn, and the slower moving planets like Uranus, Pluto, and Neptune. They all go retrograde. The sun and the moon don't. They're technically lights and luminaries. They're not planets, but all the planets do retrograde. And that's because of the perspective of how we see the movement in the sky from Earth, right? It's not because those planets are actually stopping and moving backwards. They're not. It's just in astrology, the way that the planets move through the zodiac from our perspective on Earth, it starts to look like they are moving backwards. And in fact, in astrology, where we use degrees as planets move through the signs, the degrees actually move backwards. We'll be going from 25 degrees Gemini back to 8 degrees Gemini in the retrograde. And when it goes direct, it'll go from 8 degrees Gemini back to 25 degrees. And you remember, we just talked about the pre and post shadow, and that very much has to do with those degrees. Retrogrades are a time of slowing down, of reflecting and realigning. It lasts around 80 days. Now let's see, how do we work best with Mars retrograde? If you want to take some notes here, these are my recommendations for how to work with Mars retrograde to make the best out of it. Slow down. I know people are going to be like, I can't, I'm too busy. But actually, this is the time, especially when you're so busy and you're like, I just can't take a break. It's really the best time to try to take a break and get some perspective. How to do that, I know that's tricky, and everyone has their own individual situation. I do recommend that you try to find a way to step back and get some perspective. That might be, your weekends or your evenings, or, you carve a little bit of time out of your day, maybe your lunch break, or you wake up just 15 minutes earlier just to have 15 minutes of peace and quiet before all the madness begins, to just kind of like listen to what is going on, what comes up in your thoughts. What are you dreading to do? Because with Mars retrograde, I think one of the best ways to work with it is to lighten your load and to figure out where can you make cuts. And because Mars has a more physical aspect to it, where a Mercury retrograde is going to be more mental and about communication, Mars is about how you take action and get things done in your determination. It's a time, when we're talking about reflecting and realigning, where you can cut out what is holding you back. What are the weights that are holding you down, where if you could cut some of those things off, lighten your load, then it would make it easier for you to move forward. And the forward movement is really going to come as we go into the direct motion in January, and then that time period between January and March where it's picking up speed, where you'll really be able to see the changes come into effect. Like maybe you can't make those changes now, but now is the time where you're deciding like what stays and what goes. What am I doing that I can cut out of my schedule so it frees me up to really focus on the important things. So as you're hearing, there's some prioritization that is going on during the Mars retrograde, but especially as it relates to taking action, to your motivation, your drive, what determination do you have inside of you that there's something that's really, really, really important to you in life, and you feel like all these other things keep getting in the way, and how can you free up some of your time? Look at the overgrowth in terms of how it relates to your time and your physical energy, and what can you kind of trim up. Think of an overgrown yard and like getting out there and just cutting the weeds and trimming out some things and clearing up some space. Same concept. It's a metaphor, but think of it that way. Or what are you carrying around on your back, metaphorical back, that if you could get some of that weight off, that you lighten your load, you ease your burden, and now you have more energy, you have more ability to move forward. So during this retrograde, this is a time to really be evaluating, to review, reflect, look at your calendar, look at your goals. We're coming to the end of the year where it's going to be goal setting time for many people, and think about how are you doing? What are you carrying around that you can let go? What can shift and pivot for you? I would recommend also that you look at your exercise routine. If you exercise, if you overdo it sometimes, or if you push too hard, or let me rephrase that, because it may not be that you're pushing too hard, but during the Mars retrograde, it may feel like it's more difficult to do what you usually do. And if you do really intense workouts, you may want to consider being more gentle or switching it up to do something more gentle during this time period, especially if you're feeling really fatigued outside of your exercise routine. If you don't exercise at all, then you might want to start doing some gentle exercise. Like I wouldn't just jump in and start doing something really hardcore. And thinking about how we're going into the new year, and a lot of people want to start a new exercise routine right after the new year, that you want to start off slowly and do something very gentle, something that's not going to really tax your body. All right, some other things that you can do under the Mars retrograde is avoid pushing the limits, avoid things that are high risk. You really want to be careful not to put yourself at risk of getting any kind of injury. And if you have any past injuries, you want to take extra care that you're not doing something so intense that you could re-injure yourself. That's really important. I want to talk about Mars in the sign of Gemini. That's going to give it some extra flavor. Gemini is an air sign, so it does bring some mental quality to this retrograde. Gemini is a dual sign. It's the sign of the twins. So it can be that you find you have to kind of cut back to two different priorities and not just one, or that you have two priorities that are vying for your attention and you're really struggling to manage both of them. And so using this retrograde to come up with how you're going to realign that. One of the things that I've been applying for the last year, well, 2 years now, is this concept called simplifying. It's going to sound so easy. You're going to be like, oh, that's just kind of ridiculous. It's so easy. But I tried using it. I did some research on it, and it actually works. And when I found myself up against maybe a deadline or a project that was just so big and overwhelming, and it's just like, I don't even know how to jump into this, simplify. I would say to myself, all right, I'm making this about perfection or about ideally all the different things that I could do to make it amazing. when what I needed to do was to just simplify it and get it done. You might want to try simplifying things during this Mars retrograde. Some of the things to watch out for is your nervous system, because Gemini is a Mercury sign, and there could be just some increased nervousness or kind of just feeling a little bit amped up, but fatigued at the same time. There could be maybe some sleeping disruption. So watch out for those things, and watch your caffeine intake, especially if you're really susceptible to how caffeine impacts you. Slow down and smell the roses. So Mars retrograde is a time to notice your pace, like how fast are you moving? And are you taking the time to stop and smell the roses, as the saying goes? Stop and look at beauty rather than just moving by it. I used to laugh when I lived in San Diego, and I would drive by the ocean every day, and there would be a day and I would just be particularly caught up in some project, something, a due date, or whatever frustration. And then you're driving in traffic and people are honking their horns and upset about traffic, and then I would look over and I'd see this beautiful ocean, and I'd be like, why am I letting myself get upset when there's this beautiful thing that I'm right next to? And in this very moment, being frustrated or annoyed or perseverating on something isn't solving the problem. And wouldn't I be better off just stopping and admiring the fact that I live next to this beautiful ocean? And instead of driving next to it, being caught up in something that isn't even helping me solve a problem, rather than admiring the ocean, like, wow. So that, you may not live near an ocean, but you probably live close to something that's beautiful, whether it's in your home, whether it's your garden in your yard, the neighbor's flowers, a park nearby, whatever it is. Try to start recognizing the beauty around you, appreciation for that, because that alone can just help you slow down. It's like all of a sudden you've pivoted and you're like, oh, look at that. It can just help calm your system. I would recommend, not just slowing down, but slowing down and engaging in something that brings you some peace. I did want to share with you the last 2 retrograde periods, because if you look back, like if you journal and you kind of were writing down like what was going on for me at this particular time in my life, you can see how Mars retrograde could have showed up for you in the past. So in September through November of 2020, Mars was retrograde in the sign of Aries. And then in June through August of 2018, it was retrograde in Aquarius, and a couple of weeks in late Capricorn, because it changed signs when it went retrograde. So just to, if you wanted to go back and look at previous periods, and then if you want to think about the next time, because I do recommend working with these retrograde cycles. If you start working with them, you're really honoring what you've done in the past and going back and acknowledging that, and just checking in on, how is all that going? And then moving forward, because it's kind of like you move forward, you stop, you reflect, you realign, and then you move forward, and then taking these pauses and looking backwards. Not something that is highly taught so much. In the business world, there's like, evaluate and review. And I think that's a wonderful concept. And I would say, let's just apply it to all of our life, not just how well did we do on that last campaign? What are the stats? What are the reports saying? But actually looking at the most important thing in life, your life mission. Why are you here? What is your purpose in life? And are you doing things that are taking you in that direction? And so during this Mars retrograde, you really want to slow down, pause, take care of your nervous system, notice what extra weight you're carrying, how do you have overgrowth in your metaphorical garden that needs to be cut out, so you can lighten your load and move towards what you want to do in your life. Remembering this is a Mars retrograde, so it has that more physical component that has to do with how am I taking action? How am I getting things done in life? How am I motivated from the inside to go get something done out there on the outside? If you want to take the Mars retrograde in Gemini even deeper, you can look at your own chart. If you have your chart, then you know your rising sign and you know where Gemini falls in your chart. Gemini is going to be on one of the 12 pieces of the pie in the circle that looks like a chart. That part of the chart is going to represent something. It's going to represent some topics, some events, some people, and that's going to give you a lot more information to the areas in your life where this Mars retrograde energy is going to be more prevalent. And it can help you focus in on the areas of life where you may want to really start doing some alignment, some reprioritization, and even taking some things out of your schedule so that it allows you to really move forward when we get to the direct motion part. If you like to journal, I highly recommend that you journal during the Mars retrograde. Journal about your energy levels, journal about where you feel overwhelmed, where there's too much to do. Journal about your life mission. Where do you want to be in 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years? What does retirement look like you? And maybe not retirement, but where is your pivot? Where is it where you finally have more freedom in your average day to do the things you really want to do versus having to go to work to a job for money so that you can survive in our world? So just kind of think about, what do you really want your future to look like? And are the actions you're taking right now leading you in that direction? And journaling about those things can be really helpful as you're reflecting and realigning. And if you journal regularly, as years go by, you start to have a collection of information that you can refer to on yourself that you think you're going to remember, but there's so many things that we don't remember. And especially like how we felt, our emotions, our frustrations. If you write, in this time period, I'm feeling really nervous, or in this time period, I'm feeling very relaxed, or in this time period, I'm feeling really motivated. If you start including that in your journaling, it can really help when it comes to reflection. When you're doing the Mercury retrograde reflections, the Mars retrograde reflections, and the Venus retrograde reflections, it can start to be even more useful if you're actually working with these cycles to help you achieve your goals. I wanted to mention one more thing. Mercury is going to go retrograde at the end of December. This upcoming Mercury retrograde is going to fall inside of the Mars retrograde. It's going to be kind of like a double dose of looking backwards, of realigning not just your physical action, but also your communication and your way of evaluating things mentally. And so I'll talk more about that when we get closer to that retrograde, but I did want to mention that we're going to be able to work with these two different cycles at the same time. So I will definitely keep you posted on that. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope that this helps you work through the Mars retrograde and use this time period to benefit you rather than feeling like, oh gosh, another retrograde, oh, this is terrible. I really believe that the universe sets us up for, or it's trying to help us, I should say. And the retrograde is definitely a reflective mode. And when we try to push through it and pretend like everything's at the same pace as usual, that's when we can really run into the frustrating parts. And when we start to use it as a tool for reflecting and realigning, it can really help us move through the time period. Now, it's not probably going to eliminate every frustration, and it's not necessarily going to give you more energy now that you're aware of these things. But knowing that you may be more fatigued, that your nervous system may be more taxed, you can start doing things to help counter that and help balance that and make it a much more pleasant process and helpful, because hopefully by March, you will feel like you've really pivoted and adjusted things so that you're moving forward in the right direction, the direction that you want to go. Okay, well, thank you so much again for watching the video. I am just putting the final touches on a calendar for 2023 that's going to have all the retrogrades on it for Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. I'm going to expand. So in the videos, I am starting with Mars. I have been doing Mercury retrograde for a couple of years now. And as I move forward, I'm going to start including all the retrogrades. So if you'd like to get a copy, it's a one-page piece of paper that you can print and stick up on your wall. It's going to have also the new moon and the full moon phases, the eclipses, the solstices, the equinoxes, and the retrogrades. So I made this because I wanted a really quick cheat sheet. I will include the pre and post shadow dates as well. So it'll just be a really handy calendar and can help you plot out your, realignment reflection times and your forward movement times. And if you really want to work with these cycles like I do, this calendar can be very helpful. So just make sure you're on my email list because you'll get it for free. I'm going to send it out to everyone on my email list, and it should be ready in the next week or two. If you want to sign up for my email, my website address is loribarnesastrology.com, and I'll link to it below. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.